So my name is Åsa Renman, and I work as a water coordinator for all these Norwegian environment and outdoor NGOs. And as their water coordinator, I work with all sorts of environmental impacts and issues related to the Water Framework Directive. And of course, in Norway, that includes hydropower. And I just want to begin with stating clearly that we are not against hydropower, by no means. We realize that there are lots of benefits. It certainly built Norwegian welfare and was important long before the oil came into the picture. And it's strongly connected to Norwegian independence, really. So it's no wonder it's annoying when environmentalists like us come and sort of disturb that idyllic image. Of course, it's also impressive engineering and just an enormous effort from the workforce. A lot of the hydropower in Norway is, of course, built like 100 or 150 years ago. And it's easy to realize that many of the facilities back then were built without environmental concerns. As you can see, health and safety were hardly invented back then. So that's why we're here. It's time to take nature into account. And it's great that there is a conference like this, so thanks again for organizing it. And I assume that people are here because you really want to discuss and learn about how to make hydropower sustainable for real. Not just adjusting the paperwork to make it fit doing nothing or little. Society and people obviously want electric energy, but we need to be aware of this balance, where you have nature on one side and society's need for power on the other. We also need to understand that nature is the basis for society and economy. So we have to remember this big picture. It was made clear in the Montreal Agreement and the Nature's Deal that we need to adapt to the planetary boundaries. The climate crisis is bad, but in many ways we're further out in terms of biodiversity loss. And so we can't afford a one-sided focus on just the need for more energy. We have to look at how to reduce the environmental costs at the same time. And that's the reason that we, the environmental and outdoor NGOs in Norway, are so frustrated, because we are. And that's, until now, our experience is that the sector has put a lot more energy and efforts into adjusting things to make it look as if they meet the sustainability criteria, rather than actually doing things on the ground to improve the environmental status in the affected rivers. Norway is very rich in water, with our fjords and our lakes and our rivers. And these are all screenshots from the official Norwegian travel guide. And this is how many Norwegians and tourists, of course, picture Norway. So just to set the scene, in addition to a red list for species, Norway also has a red list for ecosystems and habitat types. And this committee has assessed that river and stream water bodies are more than 30% degraded over the last 30 years, and in the category near threatened. So streams and large rivers in Norway, all the running water, is on the ecosystem red list. How about that? And in their comments, this committee wrote that the real impact from hydropower is actually much higher, as most of the hydropower was built so long ago, but this committee only considered the degradation in the last 50 years. So the real impact is actually much higher. And with such large proportion of the water habitats impacted by hydropower, it also, of course, affects hundreds of species. Hydropower, as was stated before, is not the only impact, but hydropower has its big share of responsibility for putting some iconic species on the red list, like the Atlantic salmon, which is near threatened, the eel, which is endangered, the freshwater pearl mussel, which is vulnerable. And I included the sea trout as well. It's not assessed in the red list, they only looked at trout overall. But in 40% of the rivers, the sea trout population has a status that's bad or very bad, or populations are even lost. That's all according to this scientific advisory committee. So people ask, but aren't there rules and environmental requirements in today's hydropower? And yes, for new, like Martin Britton said here, all new hydropower that's built in the last couple of decades or so, they have more modern rules. But remember, in Norway, a lot of the hydropower is old. It's built more than 50 years ago. And for these old licenses, there are basically no or very few environmental terms. And when we're talking about new hydropower, we're not all that convinced either that we always manage to look at the total pressure in a watershed when you're planning new projects in already affected rivers. So people then ask, but if it's so old, licenses must certainly get, upgraded to and modernized like all other industry. And like we heard, old licenses, they go through this kind of revision of terms in the licenses, and it can lead to an improved environmental status. It's not always satisfactory. This here is from a photo from the Aura River after revision, and as you can see, it's still quite dry. And there are several aspects with these revisions that we are quite critical of. First of all, it can only be done in 30-year intervals. Up until now, we heard that there were several in the pipe, but up until now, there are only about 20 that are finished. And in average, they took over 10 years in time. And the regular way is still that local NGOs or municipalities have to request revisions to open. So there's a very weak connection to the Water Framework Directive. And we think, or we work for, that the authorities should simply open revisions in cases where the environmental status in the Water Framework Directive requires it or calls for it. But revision is not really intended to bring old licenses up all the way to modern status. This is a quote from the Minister of Petroleum and Energy, who says that the authorities do not have the same possibilities to use the strict environmental requirements that apply to new hydropower development today in cases of revision of licenses. So Norway has basically decided that old hydropower facilities should not meet the same environmental standard as new ones. It shouldn't be a level playing field. In Norway, we also have a lot of unlicensed power. It's fully legal, but it doesn't have a license. Most of these are small facilities, but 60 or so are in the range between 10 and 99 gigawatt hours per year. The list here, these 16, each produce between 100 and 1,500 gigawatt hours per year. As you can see, most of them are old, and they have no license. There has been no environmental assessment, and there's no connection to the Water Framework Directive. Authorities can't impose monitoring or measures or anything here. And it's not possible to ask for a revision of the terms in the license because there isn't a license. However, there is a section in the law that allows these unlicensed facilities to be summoned for licensing, but that is only possible in special circumstances. And I'll try not to go too much down into the technical details here, but just to sort of illustrate what's required to meet the threshold of special circumstances. This is an example from Trøndelag, which is the county we're in. And here it was a local cabin owners association and local Friends of the Earth that asked for revision of the regulation of a lake. And it was supported by the River Basin Subdistrict and the municipality, who added that the revision should look at all the hydropower facilities in the watershed, in line with integrated water management. And here, in the end, it turned out to be one license from 1922, which was based on this old law from 1887 that no one had heard of. So it turned out not to be revisable, but it would be possible to do something called a modification of the old license. And then there was this other regulation and an hydropower station that can then be summoned for licensing. They were unlicensed. And the authorities here underlined that this summoning and modification would require special circumstances to be met, which would be the same as important public interest and vital nature. So the county governor and others, they lined up all the arguments for why these facilities should be considered to meet these special circumstances requirements. There was eel there. The population status for the Atlantic salmon was poor. There was sea trout, Arctic char, important for local anglers, but a population in decline. There was a nearby nature reserve with about 30 red-listed species of birds, and also several populations in decline. There was with ground nesting waterfowl struggling because of the artificial flooding during the breeding period. like this lapwing here, which has its nest on the ground. In addition, docks and piers and buildings and boats were damaged due to the regulation. And it was also pointed out that the lakes and the rivers are used for outdoor activities, both summer and winter. This here is ice fishing on the Lake Gangåsvatnet. So, still, the authorities concluded that these cases did not fulfill the requirements for special circumstances, so no modification of this existing license and no summoning of the two unlicensed. They continue into eternity without a license. This case was also one of 8 that the River Basin Management Plan suggested be prioritized in this planning cycle. So, our conclusion here is that we do not know what on earth is needed to meet the threshold of what's called special circumstances. And because of all this, we really welcomed and have worked a lot with trying to understand the EU taxonomy on sustainable finance. And we think that if the intention works, we think it will make a difference for the river ecosystems. However, the position that the Norwegian authorities and the government has taken is clear. This statement here was from the State Secretary in the Ministry of Petroleum and Energy to the Norwegian Public Broadcasting Company in an article on how the EU taxonomy might affect hydropower. And it was probably meant to calm down the industry, but it obviously didn't calm us down. We've asked the ministry for a comment on this or a reply, but we haven't heard anything. So, in the last round of river basin management plans, Norway had an unproportionately high number of exemptions. We heard about these exemptions earlier. Norway had about 1,400 exemptions, while hydropower nations like Austria and Sweden had 10 each. And yes, Norway produces more hydropower, but not 140 times more. But after the EU Commission clarified that the exemptions is not compatible with the taxonomy, it's now clear that it's not attractive to be on this list anymore. I know that there were also other processes going on in the Norwegian water management, but in this round of the river basin management plans, the number of exemptions is down by a third or so. And that's of course good, because it means that these water bodies are then supposed to meet good ecological potential. Unfortunately, this brings us to our next point of frustration, because this is now a bit Water Framework Directive technical. We heard about this in Voter's presentation. But for heavily modified water bodies, we're then supposed to reach this good ecological potential, which is the ecological level that's reachable by carrying out all the measures that are technically and economically realistic. Which means you should actually make use of the technology and research that's there and implement measures that improve the ecological status. But Norwegian authorities, they have this practice of setting good ecological potential as equivalent to the current status, without much or any assessment of the actual potential in the river. And it just can't be that hydropower facilities that are like 100 years old or several decades old have already fulfilled this potential because the knowledge wasn't there when they were built. So there is a lot of good research. These are some of the key Norwegian reports, and many of the authors of these are probably here or following. And this knowledge and technology really needs to be made use of. So all we ask is put this into practice. Today's knowledge on environmental design, ecological flow, secure up and downstream migration, making sure the opening and closing flow as in hydropeaking is not exaggerated, but takes into account that there are fish and other species living in the rivers. And that there's enough water, to secure sediment transportation and sustain the species there. There has to be some focus on the environment besides just maximizing profit. There are many frustrating cases, but like the NRK, the Public Broadcasting put in an article, the companies aren't the culprits here. It's the Ministry of Petroleum and Energy that approves of what they're doing. Basically, many of these old, they have, a license to kill. Small and large companies in Norway, but in general, Norwegian hydropower can afford some environmental measures. Statkraft's net income, according to was 73.9 billion last year. And they claim in their annual report that all their hydropower in Europe meets the Water Framework Directive and the taxonomy criteria, and that is thus sustainable. The fact that Statkraft and other actors in Norwegian hydropower claim everything they do is sustainable isn't that strange if you look at this sentence from the Norwegian guidelines regarding Water Framework Directive Article 4.7, which has to do with new activity and impact. It's sort of taken out of its context, but that's become like a safe haven here. If an activity is carried out in accordance with a permit granted by a public authority, the requirement for sustainability is considered fulfilled. Those eel here have not been asked. So, back to the eel. If you want to have sustainable hydropower, simply ensure that the habitat of the affected waterways can support healthy and thriving populations of the species that belong there. As simple as that. Thank you.